This meeting of the Public Pension Oversight Board is called into order. Madam Secretary, if you call the roll.
Senator Berg, Senator Carroll, Senator McDaniel, Senator Mills, Senator Neal, Senator Nemus,
Present.
Senator Wilson, Representative Bojanowski, Representative Fleming, Representative Graham,
Here.
Representative Petrie,
Here.
Representative Pratt, Representative Tipton,
Here.
Representative Weber,
Here.
Mike Harmon,
Here.
John Hicks, Victor Maddox,
Here.
Sharon Mattingly, Representative Hale,
Here.
Senator Higdon, Representative Johnson.
Here. We do have a quorum. We do have a quorum and are duly constituted to conduct business. The first item of on the agenda is approval of the previous minutes. Are there any comments on the previous minutes? Motion. Have a motion to approve. We have a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? The minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is something I will be kicking off, and it is a discussion and a quick overview of a BR that we have for 2024. It's BR 31, which is the KPPA housekeeping bill. I will discuss it from up here at the chair. If we have any questions, we have some individuals who can maybe answer technical questions for us. But what I wanted to do is just give a very brief overview. If there are any questions, we'll answer those. Basically, BR 31 for 2024 is effectively the same bill that Representative Tipton ran for 2023. We got it through the House. We ran out of time in the Senate. I'm counting on my Senate members here that we can avoid that problem this year. We're going to get this thing across the finish line this year. But effectively, it's the same bill that Representative Tipton presented to us last year. I will not call on Representative Tipton to do a point-by-point. I think he's done it so many times he probably could do it from memory now, but we'll forego that. I will simply say that it is the same bill. You have a summary of the bill itself. It's a one-pager in your packet if you'd like to look at that. And as far as any changes to it, effectively the only things we've changed are a couple of minor technical details that we actually put into the bill last year. There's been further discussion, and individuals with a lot of expertise in this came to the conclusion we probably didn't need to do those particular items at this time. They're technical enough that I'm not even going to go into the details. If you have questions, we can certainly answer those. But the bottom line, it is effectively the same bill, less a little bit of information that we had last year. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Time or that the Senate could not look at this and take it up, or was it some concerns that the Senate had as to why it was not taken up in the Senate and looked at and passed?
I will answer that, but also defer to any senators here who might want to make a comment on it. My understanding was it was just detailed enough and complicated enough, late enough into the session that my understanding is the Senate wasn't comfortable with trying to take it up at that time. I don't think there were any problems with it from their perspective. It was just a matter of there was a lot there, and they just weren't comfortable. I will again defer to any senators who might want to add to that comment.
Sounded great. Nice job.
Apparently, it was close. Anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Okay, so I will be introducing this bill early in the 2024 session, and we'll be hopefully moving it through the process. Seeing no other questions, we will move on to the next agenda item. Whoop. Yes, sir, Representative Tipton.
Mr. Chairman, you're carrying a good bill this year.
I thought so this last year, too. All right, moving on. The next item of business is the annual investment review to be presented by LRC staff. And, sir, I will, even though that's not necessary, I will let you introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Brad Gross. I am a staffer with the Public Pension Oversight Board. And if you want me to go ahead, I'll go ahead.
The floor is yours, sir.
So this is per statute, twice a year, we do an investment review. This is kind of our bigger one as we close the fiscal year out, which in part helps determine the employer contribution rates, whether investments are up, investments are down. I will be as brief as possible, as much as I can. I will tell you, I am not an investment expert. I don't play one on TV. There are some very smart people at the retirement systems. If you do have a very complicated investment question, and I will defer to them probably a lot on those scenarios. So a lot of this is going over information that you've already heard as we closed out the fiscal year from the systems. A lot of it's aggregating data like assets, performance, allocations, and so on, and completing some things that we have to do through our normal review process. So looking at net plan assets, we did have a good investment year in general after having a really rough investment year the prior year. Our assets are up overall in both the pension and the health funds. The pension funds are up a little over $3 billion. The health funds are up a little over $1 billion. And so that's certainly good news that I don't have to come in and tell you that assets are going down this year. So when we look at how funds did or didn't do, one of the things that, or the main thing that drives returns are going to be, where did you have your assets invested? So you'll see on the left-hand side here, just various types of asset classes and what the relative index returns were over FY23. And you can see that if I had a lot of equity-based asset classes, my returns were going to be very good. If I had a lot more of what we call alternative asset classes, private equity, private real estate, those types of things, then I would anticipate my returns to be lower. Now, just as kind of a point of comparison to last year, all the private assets, the private equity, those were the highest returning funds. So those funds, those states that produced the highest returns last year are producing some of the lower returns this year. So just in general, we did have a rough FY22. The returns have certainly rebounded this year. Inflation rates have been cooling down some, but are still a concern and are certainly still high. To give you kind of an idea, across public pension funds, the average return in FY23 was 7.6%, compared to a negative 5.2% last year. Now, we're talking about investments today. When we talk about how does this play out into the actuarial valuations, the returns that we look at there are based upon an assumption. So if most public pension funds have an assumed rate of return of 7%, their actuarial gain that they'll put into the books and they'll smooth over time will not be 7.6%. It will be what's above that 7% hurdle rate, if you will. And when returns are down negative 5.2%, like they were last year, that means actuarially you're going to be booking a loss actuarially that's closer to 12% or above. So again, returns were driven by equities this year. The S&P 500 was up almost 20%. Alternative assets were down, like I mentioned. And out of those alternative assets, things like private equity, they're not typically valued like we would a normal asset. They are, at some point in time, the managers of those funds will value those. There has been a process as they pick those up and they do their valuations that the value of those will go down to match more like the stock market. And they're still in process of writing those down. So in FY24, we may still continue to see a downward trajectory of those private assets. So this is just a summation of the returns for the year, 1, 3, 5, 10, 20, and 30 years for all of our pension funds. You saw these in August from our different funds. This just puts it all on one piece of paper. We often say there's three kind of ways that we review the return. We ask, hey, is the return above the assumed rate of return? And you can see on the far right column the assumed rate of return for each of the individual pension funds where it says AROR. And so all of our pension funds are exceeding that assumed rate of return as we look at historical periods. We can also ask, well, each of these funds has a different asset allocation. What if I were to put these in index funds and not have active management? Those kind of the benchmark is what kind of tells me, well, if I had just passively managed, put these in index funds, how would I have done against that? Does active management produce a positive return in these situations? And then certainly we can look at what does everyone else do? And so down below there, you can see the peer comparisons, the 7.6, the 6.6 on the 1 year, and then on out from there. But those are just kind of some ideas to look at. How do we rate those? But for your all's purposes, and when we deal with the budget, the big concern is the rate above the assumed rate of return. Are we having a gain, or are we having a actuarial loss? Gains push the employer rates down. Losses push the employer rates up. This is a chart that we have shown for quite some time. This just kind of shows you by system what the rates of return have been over the last 25 years. You can certainly see that FY21 where we had a huge spike up, biggest one in 25 years, how it dropped in FY22, and we're certainly up again in FY23. So I mentioned before that asset allocation drives 90% of the returns. This kind of just gives you an idea of what each common asset class among public pensions, what they look like, public equity, fixed income, cash, and the alternatives that are generally considered alternative asset classes like real estate, private equity, real return, absolute return. And on the far right, you can see the National Association of State Retirement Administrators does a survey each year of what average asset allocations are. And so we just kind of plugged in what is that average asset allocation. So the next thing we're just going to kind of show is what are our actual asset allocations by funds. You can see CERS non-has has about half of their money in public equities. You can see that it drops down in K non-has. And then as it trends across there, we certainly have more equities as we get into TRS and a lot more equities as we get into the legislative and judicial plans on the far right. The judicial plans, legislative plans do not have alternative asset classes. And you can certainly see in these, there certainly is some alternatives as we look at TRS, KERS, CERS, and SPRS. So how does that compare against that peer value? This is a chart we show every year. You can kind of see that purple bar is that NASRA peer comparison of around 47% equities. You can see that KERS non-has is going to have a below average allocation to equities. CERS is going to be pretty comparable to that average, and when TRS and judicial will certainly have above average allocations. And you can kind of see as you move along. Fixed income, KERS is going to have above average, CERS above average on fixed income, bonds, those types of things. And the other funds are going to be pretty common in that. All of our pension funds have a below average allocation to alternatives, those private equity, the real estate, and so on. Again, you can see that comparison against the 29.4% that's a NASRA peer average. On the far right, you can see the cash holdings. Typically across pension funds, that's relatively low, a couple percentage points. KERS non-has, you will notice, has a lot of cash. They have received supplemental appropriations in the last couple of years. In this fiscal year, they received an additional $240 million. They're going to receive another $240 million next year. And they are in process of putting that money to work. They have money committed to different asset classes, but it is something that we look at. You know, they certainly have a lot in cash presently. So for fees, we discussed fees a lot in 2017 and 18. When we look at fees, you're going to see your traditional management fees. You're also going to see incentive fees or CI, which is carried interest. And carried interest is profit sharing that occurs where the pension funds are involved with a general partner, they're limited partners, and if that investor gets above a hurdle rate, they share in part of those returns. And so you can kind of see how that has worked over time. We do see our fees creeping down this year. as we're looking at that, particularly as we're watching those incentive and carried interest fees. So you may remember earlier that those private assets are starting to write down their values. And so when their values go down, the incentive fees, their returns, there's a lag in their returns and reporting, if you will. So they're lagging that down year in FY22 starting to come into play in these private assets. So the incentive fees carried interest is lower. And you'll even see in TRS where they have what you refer to as a clawback, is that they will claw back some of those fees when the returns get lower. And typically you see when returns are good, those incentive carried interest fees go up. When they're not, they go down. Out of these, KPPA, their management fees have been coming down over the course of time. And certainly because the incentive and carried interest fees are down this year, their total fees that you'll see in that column are much lower. Same for TRS. They had that clawback. Our lowest fee structure has been, and for quite a while, Judicial Form Retirement System, which is the judicial and legislative plans. You can see the basis point or BIPs, and I may just need to explain that. That's just a standard standard of measurement. All of these funds have different levels of assets when we look at terms of fees in dollars. If they charged a 1%, if the investment houses charged a 1% of assets on it, that would be 100 basis points. So when we see something that's 41.9 basis points, that's 0.419%, if that makes sense. And the retiree health funds are below that. So one question that often comes up is cash flow. This was a big issue about 2 years ago. We spent some time researching how do we measure cash flow and what is healthy, what is not. We talked to the actuaries of the systems to get an idea that you all would have some sort of standardized approach to this because cash flow can be looked at in a variety of ways. We just tried to find something that would be standard across the systems and maybe some sort of guideline to look at. So when we look at cash flow, what we do is we just look at contributions minus the benefits and expenses. So it's dollars in, dollars out. We're not adding the investment expenditures in this situation. I will tell you that as you go across public pension funds, cash flow has become a bigger issue. It's been a bigger issue in our funds in the last 10 years, and we've started to manage those cash flows, particularly the KERS non-has, which now has a positive cash flow. If you have a negative cash flow, it's not necessarily implying trouble, but it can serve as a warning. So as funding declines, assets will decline. Negative cash flow becomes a bigger percentage. And so there's a question of what part of negative cash flow becomes a problem for a public pension fund. There's really no specific standard. We read a couple of different things. We talked to the actuaries, and they kind of came up with a 3 to 5% negative cash flow. But I will say, and the caveat is, that depends upon how healthy your fund is, how mature it is, what the market experience is. And then when you look at that cash flow, you would hope that your portfolio income would offset a majority of that negative cash flow, meaning cash-based investment income. So when we look at utilizing this data, this method, if you will, you can see down below there all of our public pension funds for FY23 have a negative cash flow in this calculation, except for KERS non-has. And you can see that it is a positive 10.08%. Now, I mentioned earlier they received an additional $240 million of an appropriation that's above their required contribution. If we were to take that out, that supplemental one-time payment, it would go down to 2.28%, but would still be positive. Now, that fund is our lowest funded plan, and cash flow was kind of the devil at the door several years ago. And it has become a situation where just from contributions alone, benefit payments can be paid. Now, as we progress along that, you can see varying levels. The judicial and legislative on the far right, those funds are essentially 100% funded. I would expect there to be some negative cash flow at that point because the employer contribution rate goes down. And in particular for LRP, there are no employer contributions being paid into that fund and have not been for a while by legislative action in the budget. TRS has a negative 4% cash flow that has grown some this year. I can tell you that their employer contribution rates are projected to grow a decent bit, as we've had in the last couple meetings, over the next few years. Their benefit payments are projected to grow as well too. You take that against KERS non-HAS, where they have positive cash flow, but their benefit payment projections are expected to go down at some point about 10 to 12 years down the road. And that's just some dynamics of the demographics that they have. You can see below there the same kind of key numbers for 2022 if you want to look at the prior year. So one of the things we often have conversations about is the assumed rate of return, the investment return. And this is probably I know we have some folks that are newer on this. The investment return assumption is the assumption for public pension funds. I'm not going to say in all situations, but nearly 99% of the time, this is what is going to drive the health of the plan when we change assumptions. It is not just the rate at which we project assets to grow, it is also the discount rate on future liabilities, so that when we get a number that's as of today, like a balance sheet for public pensions, so it has an impact on the liability and the asset side. So when we lower the assumed rate of return, we're going to build a portfolio around a much lower return, but by the same time, it's going to boost up our liabilities, which is going to put more contributions in. Now, what this chart shows you is each year that NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, they have kind of kept track year by year. What have assumed rates of return been? You go back to 2001, that average was 8%. And it held there for quite some time, but you can see that standardized trend. The blue bar is that 8%. And you can see back in 2001, the vast majority of public pension funds were at 8%. We get to today, we don't have anybody there. The bigger share of folks are at that 7% range, and it has gone down relatively quickly, as you can see, in the last couple of years. Now, I will say there is a little bit of pushback about moving up in some places now as inflation has come up. When actuaries look at the assumed rate of return, they look at a couple different things. They look at a building block method, the inflation rate plus the real rate of return. So when inflation has been creeping up, it puts pressure on that dynamic when they review it. They look, how have we done in the past? They look at what do we project to have in the future? And they also look at what is everybody else doing. So there is a little bit of pressure there. And in fact, if you'll look at our public pension funds, our rates of return went down significantly over the last several years, but we do have a little bit of a bump up that's going to happen this next year in CERS non-hazardous and hazardous from 6.25 to 6.5. So in that scenario, that means liabilities are going to go down, costs are going to go down to some degree. But you can see our assumed rates of return there. I can tell you that KERS at one time was 8.25. It's now 5.25. TRS was historically at 7.5 and is at 7.1. CERS at one time was also at 8.25. So a few other kind of things as we go along. These are just some things listed in statute to do. Their investment policies are online. Their goals are to meet their assumed rate of return and meet their policy benchmarks over 5 and 10 year periods. We're supposed to report the securities litigation or the proceeds that they receive from litigation involving securities. Those are the numbers that they have provided to us. Asset class and total fund benchmarks. All plans are using recognized and industry known indices. I will say alternatives, there's just limited indices on that. Most plans are using like a public index plus CPI or something of that nature. It's really hard to find an index or something to benchmark to with the private asset type of classes. As far as allocations and targets, you will see down below each of the funds what they've set as their target, their allowable range, and the actual amounts. Where you see the highlighted red is where we are out of target or out of range on those asset classes. Again, I mentioned before, there have been some shifting in their portfolios, targets and ranges. And so we've had KPPA, I know, come in here and talk about those before. They are working towards committing that capital, the supplemental funds, if you will. But those I just have to make note of where we are not within the allowable ranges. So I'm done. I think I got that done fairly quickly. There is the retiree health performance as well in here. If you need to sleep tonight, you can pick this back up and read it again. But I would be happy to take any questions I could potentially answer.
Senator Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sir, for your presentation. And I'm just going to belie my ignorance at this point because I'm new to this committee. I'm trying to figure things out. These pages aren't numbered, but if we go back to the performance pension FY23 ended, and you look under the TRS pension policy benchmarks, it says see note for 20 years and 30 years. And I looked to that note. Really, what I am looking for at 20 years and 30 years is what is the rate of return over that time period for this plan. Mm-hmm. Can you give me that number?
So their rate of return is for 20 years, 7.3 and 7.7 as it lists there.
That's their 20. Okay. And so what's the note, the policy benchmark? Explain that to me.
So the note down there, TRS did not benchmark overall performance. They didn't have a benchmark prior to July 1, 2008. Meaning they didn't have a set benchmark to apply that against. So we're only reporting what they have available.
So by 2028, they'll be able to report that, is what you're telling me? Mm-hmm. So we need 5 more years before they can come up with that figure.
Yep.
Okay. That's
yep.
Okay.
Just as an FYI too, the slides do have numbers right below the title of the slide. You see the 5?
Yes. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay. So we don't yet know those numbers, but we do see, like 1 year changes from 30 years, pretty significantly across all of our pensions. So, when we look at our average rate of return, is that a 20-year, 30-year, 5-year? What are we using there?
So you're talking about the assumed rate of return?
Assumed rate of return, yeah.
So all of our state administered retirement systems or plans are required to do what's called an experience study. So that number, if you will, isn't necessarily a predefined time frame. That assumed rate of return is where the boards and the actuary will get together. They'll look at all the assumptions, mortality on down the line, and the assumed rate of return. They'll look at all kinds of different stats.
You got you. This is what they're hoping for.
Yeah, so that's what they're basing their funding on. That's what they're basing their asset allocations on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So then just to make sure I understand this, for the last 30 years, Teachers' Retirement System had an actual rate of return of 7.7%.
Yes.
But the assumed rate of return that we're currently using is 7.1%.
Correct.
Okay. Then if you go, and I'm sorry, guys, I'm just really trying to figure this out.
You are asking questions that there's somebody else would like to ask but didn't, so go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So then if we go on, wait, now I have to figure out what page, now that I know the page is...
Talking about the assumption page?
Yeah.
13.
Special talk, assumed rate, page 13.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What I want to know, my real question is, how far off are we on a 30-year period from our assumed rate of returns to our actual rate of returns? Over a 30-year period. That's what I want to know.
Well, if you can go back here, you have it on that first page, right?
I'm there.
Yeah. So you have your assumed rate of return here. Are you talking about each individual year and what the assumption was that year? Yeah.
No,
So
because I don't care about that year. What I care about is the aggregate of a 30-year period.
So
I'd be willing to use a 20-year period, but I prefer to use a 30-year period.
so TRS, you can see the 30-year period. Let's see if I can take the
7.7.
7.7.
So how do we work on a expected rate of return of 7.1? Aren't we just already putting ourselves behind the 8 ball if we're, I mean, well, okay, so you're saying we're expecting 7.1, we made 7.7.
Correct.
Okay. Is that too close of a margin for comfort?
Well, some would say yes and some would say no. So
Who would say yes, who would say no?
depends on the actuary you hire. It depends upon the think tank that you talk to. So let me put it this way, like, and I'll be as plain as I can be
That's
doing
what
this
I need.
for a while.
Yeah.
Sometimes we look at the investment return assumption only from an asset perspective, right? We're looking at our returns for 1, 3, 5, 10, 20, and 30. However, it's also the discount rate on liabilities, right? So what that means is they're going
Okay.
to take I know you know.
got you.
Yeah. The actuaries estimate out of all the population that's here, they literally calculate the cost for every single person, and they have assumptions about how long they're going to live, and those go out into a long time out into the future. And then they'll discount those streams of benefit payments back to today's dollars. So there's an interesting thing that if we live in a perfect world, then our assets grow by the same rate of return, assumed rate of return, and our liabilities are technically growing by the same assumed rate of return. What I'm saying where it becomes, I think, sometimes problematic is well, what if I'm only 50% funded? My assets are half the value and they're growing by that assumed rate of return, but my liabilities are growing at a higher dollar amount, if you will, right? So a lot of this gets down to the risk that you want to take. So what happens if we don't hit that, right?
Right.
Employer costs go up, state costs go up, city and county costs go up. So a good example that would be the Great Recession, or if you will, 2021. So when 2021 happened, or the Great Recession happened, right? That means they're going to take that return for that year, and the way that the actuaries do that is they smooth gains and losses over a 5-year period. So they take 20%, 21, 20% of each of the preceding 4 years, and that's how they smooth it into the funding equation. But those losses will produce unfunded liabilities that you have to pay. Now, the opposite side of that is, 2022 was the loss. 2021 was the gain. So we had these big gains that got smoothed in too. So, I mean, the question becomes, at the end of the day, all an actuary does is budget. The benefits are going to be what the benefits are, right? We're going to pay X amount of benefits out. So when we choose assumptions, we're budgeting a dollar amount of contribution that we're going to put in. It would be no different, but in a not as complex of a way. But if I had a 401k, I can sit down in these little calculators and go, I would like to have $1 million when I retire. I'm going to assume I'm going to make this amount of return. I'm going to assume I'm going to live this long. I'm going to contribute this amount. My pay is going to go up by so much, right? But if I don't have it when I get there, I can work longer. I can contribute more. I get less. In a pension plan, the benefits are set, which means the volatility happens on that contribution rate. So if we get to the point and it doesn't happen, then contribution rates go up. So when we look at where we're at today, we have a whole host of reasons we can talk about why we're here, and it becomes very emotional, I will just say. And there's a lot of reasons why we're here, but some part of that is investment returns up and down. When there's a negative 17 and a negative 21 in two of our funds in the Great Recession. And sometimes it's not just that the that the loss happens, it's when it happens too. If I'm cash flow negative, then I'm having to sell assets at a time that's not very conducive to selling assets, right?
Yeah.
No different than a
Take more
retiree on a
loss.
401k having to sell assets to live at an inopportune time.
Last question, if I may follow up, sir. So these assumed rates of return, are these safe numbers?
I'm nonpartisan, so I don't get
No,
that
that's
answer.
why I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Are these safe numbers? They're not the numbers I would use in my personal finances, which is why I worry about some of them.
Mhm.
Some of them are way outside of what I would use for my personal finances. So I want to know from a nonpartisan perspective, are these safe numbers? And the answer is going to be depends what you consider safe.
Well, again, I'm not an actuary. I don't play one on TV. That's the other one. Would I feel more comfortable the lower the rates are, that budget's a higher rate? That means I have less bill requests. So, the lower that number is, the more money that's going to be put in, the higher the likelihood is that the fund progresses. So if you were to look at KERS non-HAS as an example, that fund got down to 12.9% funded. The assumptions were changed. The payroll growth went down to 0. The assumed rate of return went down to 5.25. The mortality table shifted. And so now you have a fund that is producing a contribution rate that is cash flow positive. Cash flow is the devil at the door. That fund will improve each year as long as that rate stays up. But that rate is also projected to decrease because it's improving. So
I'm going to Representative Tipton, did you have
Thank you.
some input for this? I know you've got a lot of expertise on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Berg, to answer your question, are these safe numbers? That depends on the willingness of the Kentucky General Assembly to back them up.
Mm-hmm.
Let me explain what I mean by that. As an example, Brad mentioned when KERS lowered their rate of return and made those assumption changes and went to 5.25%, we were at a point in time where we were contributing, I think it was 43%, 40-some percent, 48% of payroll. Just because of those assumption changes, our bill went to 84% of payroll. A whole lot more money. TRS right now, as an example, they're going from 7.5 to 7.1% of payroll, and some other assumption changes. This fiscal year that we just ended, our contribution for the unfunded liability to TRS was $651 million. TRS has presented at an earlier meeting their projections for the next 2 fiscal years, I believe 811 and 907 million. So because of those changes in assumption, that means in order to have enough money to sustain those liabilities, the taxpayer, the state, has to put more money in. At 7.1, going from 7.5 to 7.1. Yeah. Now CERS has raised their assumed rate of return, so their contribution rate for the cities, the counties, and the school boards unclassified has gone down about 3 to 4%. So they're paying in less money because they're assuming that the rate of return is going to be more. So that's the give and take on how these work with what's actually contributed. But, it's regardless of what the rate of return is, as in these pension systems, we have a responsibility to make sure those benefits are there. So that means more taxpayer dollars if the returns aren't there.
Anything else, Senator Berg? Great questions. Appreciate it. Sir, looking for any other questions? Seeing none, you're off the hot seat. Thank you. It was very well done. Appreciate it, Brad. Next item on the agenda is a discussion of reemployment after retirement issues. And I think we have a couple of people who are going to come forward and help us with that. And I know this is a topic that we've gone back and forth in the General Assembly over the last several years. What's fair, what's not fair, what works and what doesn't work, and we're still working on that. So you do not look like David Eager or Bo Barnes. So I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves for the record, please.
Good afternoon. I am Rebecca Adkins. I'm the Deputy Executive Director in place of David Eager today. And really, retired reemployed is Erin Surratt, who is our Executive Director of Benefits. It is her expertise, but we have sent her to a conference, so she wasn't able to attend as either. So Carrie, however, is the expert.
I'm Carrie Bass. I'm a staff attorney supervisor with the KPPA, and I work closely with the team in the Office of Legal Services that assists members with questions on their post-retirement reemployment.
Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Can we see this okay? Are you guys good? Or should I make it smaller? Okay. All right, there are about 4 things that we kind of harp on for our members who things they need to consider as they begin to retire or as they have already retired and are thinking about reemploying after retirement. These 4 requirements are that there cannot be a prearranged agreement. They must cease employment with all agencies who are participating with retirement systems. There has to be a break in service, and there are certain forms that they have to submit. Some of this will go in a little bit more detail, and some of it I'll kind of skip through, and you can ask specific questions. The break in service, there is an exception for independent contractors, leased employees, and volunteers. People get confused with the contracts. They think the contract alone sometimes is the defining factor there. That's not true. You can still be on a contract and be an employee of the agency. What's important is that you are no longer an employee of the agency on this contract. So, whoops, too far. All right, prearranged agreements, that's just Kentucky law that says you cannot have this prearranged agreement. You can't discuss, boy, I'd like to retire, but I still need more money. Couldn't I come back later? Those kinds of discussions cannot happen before the retirement. Ceasing employment with all the participating agencies, and we've given you the statutes if you want to look at that in detail. This break.
Hang on just a second there.
Sure.
Could you give an example of that?
Which one?
The ceasing employment with all the participating employers. When you say all participating employers, can you kind of explain that maybe with an example, fictitious or otherwise?
Do you have a great example?
Sure. If a member is working for a Commonwealth agency, they need to go ahead and wrap up that employment relationship before they retire. And sometimes we might see a member who is employed full-time at a participating employer, let's say like a local fire department, for example. And then they're also working on the side as needed as a coach or a coaching assistant at their local school board. The local school board also participate in one of the retirement systems operated by the KPPA. So the member would need to resign from both their full-time gig with the fire department and from their side job as an instructional assistant coaching assistant with the local school board. So that might be an example of where the ceasing the employment relationship trips people up.
So they'd have to end their employment for any and all agencies that are anywhere under the umbrella of KPPA.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Break in service. This one's interesting. Currently, and through all the retirements as of December of 23, there needs to be, generally speaking, a 3-month break. There can be a 1-month break if the member is leaving hazardous duty and returning to hazardous duty. But if they're leaving hazardous duty, retiring from hazardous duty, and then going to be reemployed in non-hazardous, that's still a 3-month break. All of those rules are changing with retirement dates as of January 1. So I anticipate that we'll have a few issues with folks who retire in December and are going to want to come back to work in February. But that 3-month break for December retirements is still valid. People also get confused with 30 days versus 1 month, but it's an entire month. Here's just a list of the forms that are required. Obviously, the rules are intricate and interesting. The forms are still required. We won't go into those. Looking at reemployment after retirement, it's important to note that starting way back in 2008, these retired re-employees are not getting a second account. This is not folks who are still, they're going to get their pension and they're going to have a second or a third pension later. That's not true anymore and has not been true since 2008. There are break in service exemptions here at the bottom, specific for mayors and city councils, elected officials, part-time adjunct professors. Those are a little bit different. And then we have a series of folks who are exempted from paying for the employer, for the things the employer needs to think about. These people are exempted from paying the contributions and the health insurance. As an employer, if they hire somebody who's already retired, they report them to us as retired or employed because they are full-time employees. They pay the regular contributions that they would pay for everybody on those employees. If they're KERS non-hazardous, that's the normal cost. If they are any of the other systems under KPPA, it's the full percentage that all the other employees are paying. And then once we start getting that reported to us, when we run our retirement every month, we see who we're paying retirement health insurance for, and then we bill it back to those agencies, and there's just a separate invoice. There are exceptions, and these are the exceptions listed here. It's sheriffs, city police, school resource officers, and there's post-secondary. There's a few of these who have a limit. The agency has a specific limit to how many people that they can retire or reemploy under these exemptions. But in general, those are the numbers that we're seeing right now, retired, reemployed within these entities. Not all of them have the agency-specific exemptions. Looking at the qualifications for these exemptions, I'll just leave that to you guys to read. We won't look at that specifically. Let's look at these numbers. That is hard to read. Okay, hang on. Nope, I can't see it. Okay. We are counting, this is the number of people who have retired from these plans and are now reemployed. So there are 179 state police who are reemployed, but they're not reemployed state police because state police is not reporting retired reemployed to us. They're reemployed elsewhere. 2,914 in C non-hazardous are reemployed. They might be in C non-hazardous, they might be elsewhere. The total here is 6,062. And then this is how the retirement systems benefit from these amounts. The first column, other than planned, the column in the middle there is health insurance reimbursement. So that's when we bill them for the health insurance reimbursement. KPPA, the 5 plans get back $13.8 million. This was in fiscal 23. And pension and insurance, that's $31.9 million and $4.8 for a total of $50.7 million just in fiscal 23 from retired reemployed contributions and health insurance reimbursements. That is all I had, unless you guys had a specific question.
Representative Tipton?
Thank you. Last year, when we were working on the housekeeping bill, we talked about reemployment, retirement. It's kind of complex. It's kind of confusing. Am I correct that there is a lot of inconsistency between the plans on how reemployment, retirement reemployment works? And would it be simpler if there were more consistency and more conformity in those plans?
Well, it is very complicated. Carrie lives and breathes this all the time. From a plan perspective, it's fairly consistent for us until you get into these exemptions, which is why you guys asked specifically for the exemptions. Carrie, you got a different answer for that?
I think among the plans that the KPPA provides day-to-day operations for, the rules that are addressed or geared at members are pretty consistent. You will see some variation in the rules on the employer side, since there are different employer contribution requirements for some of the CERS employers. But I can't speak to the consistency when you compare like TRS, judicial and legislative. I don't know their rules. So
Additional question, Mr. Chair. I know that you mentioned Kentucky law and break-in service, and also, I forgot my term now, separation. How closely is that tied to federal law? And I know there was a question a few years ago when the KPPA, we went to the 1 month about IRS guidelines on that. Could you comment on that a little bit and how all that works?
The Kentucky law, it kind of breaks things down a little bit more than the federal requirement, which is the federal requirement is that the employee or member have a separation from service, and then there's all these little pockets of legal opinions or regulations that get into what a separation from service is. Kentucky law breaks it down into essentially 3 components. You've got to cease your employment relationship with participating employer before retirement. You can't have that prearranged agreement, and you've got to have that break-in service. I think what makes some of our federal tax law experts a little nervous about that 1 month break-in service is the ability of the KPPA to ensure that those members truly have severed and wrapped up their employment relationship before they retire. And then when they come back on board, that's just a matter of circumstances. It's not something that was prearranged or agreed upon before retirement. They really did clear out their offices. They really did say goodbye to their coworkers, and just circumstances beyond anyone's control brought them back. So that 1 month break is a pretty short window when you look at other pension plans across the United States.
The penalties, we didn't talk about that, but the penalties for a member who retires and then returns to work too early and or doesn't observe that or is pretty significant. We void their retirement. They have to pay back those. They can obviously retire again. They don't lose service in that mix, but it's significant. It's the worst phone calls that our counselor series have to make to say, this is a problem.
Mr. Hicks?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Rebecca. The slide you have up right now, particularly the middle column pension, would those figures comprise both pre-2008 retirees who are in a second, retirement, and post-2008 retirees who don't have a second retirement?
No, these are only post-2008. So we code them differently within our system. Those are the ones we call retired, reemployed. The other ones will appear under active numbers.
So in some way you might say this is the benefit to the plan.
Absolutely.
Of
This
employer
is the
contributions that aren't related to an individual's future annuity.
Yes.
Thanks.
The retired reemployed statute specifically say they're paying these contributions to help pay down the unfunded liability. Yes.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
That Representative Bojanowski is watching online, and she has sent a question in regards to what is a critical shortage area, and to what would it take to remove the day and the wage limit for part-time and substitute teachers.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly,
The critical, I think what she's asking about the term critical shortage, and if there is a shortage, why can it be removed in terms of the day in which and the wages which they are limited for a part-time and substitute teacher. In other words, coming in as a substitute teacher or as a part-time teacher.
so
Does that make sense?
remove that break-in service requirement between retirement and when they can, the earliest they can start back, which going back a few slides, in January that will only be a 1 month required break-in service. So the question is, what would be required to get that person back,
back
into
into the classroom.
substitute or part-time position with, the next day after retirement or just a few weeks after retirement. So from a federal perspective, there are certain things that would have to be in place there. I think a good place to look is some of the exemptions that are in place for mayor and city council members. So for that exception, if the person who's serving as a part-time employee or a substitute employee doesn't have any service credit in the relevant retirement system, they can go ahead and start performing that job duty ASAP. For example, if a state employee is retired and then wants to go and serve as a city council person, they don't have to observe those break-in service requirements because they are retiring from KERS and going to work for a CERS employer. I know that's a little complicated, but that's an option. There are also some age-based federal law exemptions that would, if put into state statute, would allow folks at or above a certain age to serve in those part-time or substitute roles. But essentially what I'm trying to say is there are federal law requirements that we would need to see reflected in state law changes.
And I represent Graham. I suspect you're going to want
Go
to
with
ask that question
after
again when TRS comes up.
Yes.
But you did hit on a point. If you want to cross boundaries and take a KERS employee and bring them into TERS, we're going to discuss that next month, I think. I think it's even more complicated when you start crossing those funds.
Absolutely, and that is an excellent point, Representative Johnson, is that unfortunately the TRS requirements and KPPA requirements, unfortunately for the members, they don't always match up. So members have to ask kind of both of us for input on their reemployment situation.
So fair warning for next month, we're probably going to discuss that.
Okay.
So. Anything else, Representative Graham? Anyone else? Very good. Well, ladies, thank you. Oh, go ahead. You have something to finish with?
Could I let Representative Graham, could I give you an update on Baptist Health for a second?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
We met, the Retiree Health Committee met yesterday, and last month when PPOB met, you asked us about providing information to our members. We have added the form online. If they have problems getting their Baptist Health medical folks to recognize that they can pay out of network, then there's a form that they can literally take this piece of paper. I printed one out. It has lovely Humana green pieces on it, and they can take that, and Humana will take it from there. It's a phone call that they can make, and it's on our website. So are you still getting any questions from members about it?
In other words, the phone call will address the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Representative Graham, can you hit the mic again,
I'm
please?
sorry.
Thank you. That's all
So
right.
what you're saying is that the phone call will be, if they call, it will tell them what they really need to do in terms of getting the services that they need.
Yes. And our folks said
And
yesterday.
that has been disseminated out to the retirees?
Mhm, and it's on our website.
Okay.
And our folks said yesterday, pretty much the problems have ceased. So, well, for our folks, they're still coming up and saying, but it didn't work for my sister. But their sister is not with us.
Well,
and so it's a different MA.
I figured something had been worked out because I was not getting the phone calls that I had. So that's good to hear that it's been cleared up, or they're working towards making sure that anyone who needs service can see their doctor.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for.
Any other questions? Once again, ladies, thank you very much. Very helpful. We'll discuss crossing the fence next month. And last but not least, Bo, I think you're out there, but I think I had an obstructed view of you and didn't know you were in the room. So come on up. Yes, sir. Yeah, in fact, I'm going to ask you to restate it. I'll allow him to do his presentation first, and then we'll come back to that because I think it needs to be answered.
I think what it is, Bo, is about teachers going back in, and because there's a shortage of teachers being able to go back in and to work as a substitute or as a part-time employee during that period of time? Excuse me.
Yes, I've got several numbers I'll discuss today about
Okay.
that issue, and maybe that will help. And then if you have any follow-up questions, I'd be glad to take those. But
And if you would go ahead and introduce yourself for the record.
hello, yes. Good afternoon. Bo Barnes. I serve as Deputy Executive Secretary and General Counsel for Teachers Retirement System, TRS. Let me just try to.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a similar presentation that KPPA just gave, and we'll go right ahead with that. TRS has return to work provisions that are codified in statute, KRS 161-605, and there are three primary purposes of these return to work provisions. One, they allow retirees to return to the classroom to help districts with staffing needs. But importantly, they do so in a manner that is, one, actuarially sound. These retirees continue to make contributions to TRS in their TRS covered position. Also, very importantly, there are limitations in the number of days they can work, and even more importantly, there are limitations on how much a retiree can earn in a TRS covered position. And those limitations vary depending on how many years of service that retiree retires with. And this is very important because we don't want to incentivize premature retirements, where we have large numbers of teachers retiring much earlier than the system is designed for. So that's why we have this in place. Secondarily, these return to work provisions allow teachers to help with staffing needs in a way that complies with federal law. TRS is a qualified plan under Section 401A of the Internal Revenue Code. That allows our teachers to make contributions to TRS on a tax-deferred basis, so they have more take-home pay in their paycheck. It's a very important tax advantage that we make sure we maintain. And part of the things we have to do to maintain our status under 401A is that the IRS expects there to be bona fide retirements, that people aren't having sham retirements where they're retiring in place just to continue to receive their salary and a pension. So there's a couple of ways we do this. One, we have breaks in service between the date of retirement and the date for a retiring teacher to go back to work. And we'll talk about those in some of the later slides. And that also helps keep the system actuarially sound. And then also, very importantly, there can be no prearranged agreement between a retiring teacher or employee and that employer for that retiring employee to return to work for the employer after retirement. On this slide, we have what we call the TRS return to work permanent rules. In the next few slides, we'll talk about some temporary rules and temporary changes that have been put in place for a short period of time. On the left-hand side, you'll see a description of the different return to work programs at TRS. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the key permanent rules for those programs. Looking at the upper left-hand corner, you'll see part-time, full-time. That represents our standard return to work program. And that is the program that is used overwhelmingly by our retirees to go back to work. And if you go to the right-hand side, you'll see that there are required breaks in service under this standard program. For retirees returning to work part-time, a 3-month break in service is required from the date of retirement before that retiree can go back to work for a TRS employer. If they're going back full-time to a different employer or a different school district, the required break in service is still 3 months. If they're going back to work for the same employer, same district, a 12-month break in service is required. And both part-time and full-time in the standard program have wage limitations. Below that, you'll see in the left-hand side, critical shortage part-time, critical shortage full-time. Critical shortage has the same breaks in service as our standard return to work programs. The only difference is there's no limitation on the amount of income that retiree can earn in a TRS covered position. Here we have.
Well, before you go any
sure.
further on, just I like examples. So when you say there's no wage limit, is that simply that the school board, local school board, can decide how much they want to pay someone based upon their own
Yes.
personal, their local needs?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, temporary changes are described on this slide. And in the 2022 regular session, certain temporary changes were made to those permanent rules that I just discussed. And these changes that are only for local school districts and no other TRS employer. And eligibility is limited only to TRS retirees, and they apply regardless of whether that retiring teacher is going back in a certified position as a teacher or a classified position like a school bus driver. They apply to both. And what these return to work changes do is they provide certain relaxation of some of the requirements that we saw with the permanent rules. And we're going to discuss those just briefly in the next couple of slides. And this law sunsets June 30th, 2024. And after that date, we go back to the permanent rules only. Let's see. This slide, we have the temporary changes, what they exactly are. On the left-hand side, you have the different programs, again, description of different programs. On the far right-hand side, we have the temporary changes that sunset June 30th, 2024. And in the middle, you have the permanent rules just for comparison. And what these temporary changes do is they provide a 1-month break as a substitute for the 3 and 12-month breaks. So for part-time, or our standard part-time and full-time program, and our critical shortage part-time and full-time program, you don't have to observe the 3 or 12-month breaks in service. 1 month is sufficient. And the only other thing that they really do is with the critical shortage program, there's a limitation on the number of retirees that a school district can bring back in the critical shortage program. And under the permanent rules, that limitation is the school district can have no more than 1% of its TRS participating employees as retirees in the critical shortage program. But every school district gets at least 2 critical shortage positions. Under these temporary changes, that 1% is increased to 10%. What does not change? So there's a lot that doesn't change, and this is important because I think some folks kind of forgot that these provisions were still in place, and they thought all the return to work provisions were done away with the temporary legislation. Federal and state laws continue to prohibit prearranged agreements for that retiree to return to the school district in any position, whether it's certified or classified. Retirees in the standard part-time and full-time program still have a limitation on wages and potentially days. Very importantly, reciprocity retirees must observe the breaks in service and other return to work rules for each retirement system they retired from. So for our retirees who have retirement service credit in TRS and also retired with service credit in county employees retirement system, for example, they need to observe our break in service, but also, and other return to work rules, they also need to observe CERS's breaks in service and return to work provisions. Also, if a retiree goes back in a position where they're eligible for health insurance, they have to drop it with TRS and pick it up with their employer.
Oh, could you expand on that last line just a little bit? Explain that in a little bit more detail, please.
So when when a retiree returns to work, and for a school district, that's a teacher, for example, and they're going back full-time, part-timers not going to be eligible for health insurance, but if they're going back full-time, then they will return to the Kentucky Employees Health Plan during the duration of their reemployment post-retirement. Even if they were in our Medicare-eligible health plan, they would, in fact, federal law would require them to move from the Medicare-eligible health plan to the Kentucky Employees Health Plan for the period of reemployment. And this is my last slide. It just has some statistics, and I'll add a few more. But of TRS's over 70,000 active members, currently we had 5,219 of those were retirees returning to work. So that's about 7% of all of our active members. You see about 90% are part-time or substitute teachers. So They are overwhelmingly going back, not in full-time positions. Teachers are not going back, returning to work full-time. And that 90% might be a little low because a lot of our employers will report returning retirees as full-time because they're going back in a full-time position, although they're working part-time, and we have to reconcile that later. So it's probably a little higher than 90%. Of these 5,219 retirees returning to work, 5,111 are going back in that standard return to work program with the wage limitations. Only 108 are going back in the critical shortage program. So you can see it's not used very much by our districts, and that's discretionary with the district if they want to, seek approval for critical shortage or hire them back in the standard return to work program.
And again, that program, the critical shortage program, sunsets next summer effectively, right?
It will still exist, but the limitation will go from 10% to 1% of a district's.
Gotcha.
But as you see, we're not even bumping up against the 10% here. There are a handful of districts that have exceeded the 1%, but not many. And by handful, maybe 5 or 6.
Thank you. Is that it, or
that's it?
Okay,
Yes,
I think Auditor Harmon, you have a question?
Yeah, I also had a question on the temporary changes that went in June 30th. If you're a teacher that you've returned before the June 30th, once June 30th hits, does that reset you, or if you're already in the system, you can still be covered? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, and that's a good question. Yeah, so if you go back to work after having met that 1 month break in service by June 30th, 2024, you've met your break in service. You don't have to then have another 3 or 12 month break in service. You've met it. You're good.
Right. And does those criteria, I know it goes back to 1%, but say if you were at 5% of your teachers being through that program, you wouldn't have to necessarily shrink that to 1%. You just couldn't add another one until it went below 1%?
It would go to 1%. The critical shortage program is a year-by-year program. They have to get approval every year for that.
So if you ended up hitting, I know you said not many of them were even going over the 1%, but if you're at 5%, and then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, when June 30th of 2024 hits, does that mean that you'd have to get rid of at least the 4% of those 5%?
You could not rehire those folks at the 5% level. It would be at the 1% level.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Chairman Hale?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Could you go back and restate that again about the going back to the full time, and if they were Medicare, if they were on the Medicare, they would come off of that. And maybe I misunderstood how you said that.
So when under the statutes, return to work statutes, when a retiree returns to work for a TRS employer, and they are eligible for health insurance with that TRS employer, school district, or other employer, then they are required to drop their health insurance coverage that is provided through TRS and instead pick up the health insurance coverage that is offered by that active employer they are now working for. So that's going to be the Kentucky Employees Health Plan. And they will do that regardless of how they had health insurance through TRS while they were still a retiree, whether they're Medicare eligible or not. They are always going to go back.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
When the retiree goes back to work for the TRS employer or another employer where they get full health insurance coverage, they're going to pick up health insurance coverage with that employer. So that's what we're seeing in the districts. As I said, not many people are going back full time, relatively. But when they do, and their employer's offering health insurance to full-time employees, they have to pick it up with that employer.
So even if they were Medicare eligible, they would still have to pick that up.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And in fact, Medicare would require that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. And Leader Graham, I wanted to come back to you and see if your original question was answered. Leader Graham, Mike, please.
You would think after 20 years I would know that. You're saying that even if there is a shortage, based on federal guidelines and state guidelines, there's no exceptions to bringing people into work when you have a shortage of teachers.
Well, just as allowed under these return to work provisions.
Provision.
And you see that the critical shortage is not used very much at all. And in fact, most teachers, given these numbers, and most teachers are not going back full time. So anecdotally, we hear, when a lot of teachers retire, they are done. They're not interested. But if they are going back, it's overwhelming as a substitute teacher. So there's plenty of capacity, given even the permanent rules. There's plenty of capacity for retirees to go back to work in the classroom. And I would say even excess capacity. Because while there is a limitation, even on full time for the standard program of 3%, no one's coming close to that because teachers just aren't going back full time.
Well, it's a different environment today than it was 10, 20 years ago as well. So that makes sense a great deal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. Chairman Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we all recognize that the reason these temporary provisions were put in 2022 is because we're facing serious shortage issues with full-time teachers, substitute teachers. I do have a couple of questions. KPPA made their report. They stated that in their system, when a retiree returns to work, that retiree does not earn a second retirement, and that the employer makes the contribution, but not the employee. How does that work in TRS? Is that the same in TRS, or does that retiree earn a second retirement with both of them contributing?
Yes, sir. So with one exception, which I'll discuss, our retirees, when they return to work in a TRS covered position, they make retirement contributions to TRS, and the employer makes contributions to TRS. So we get both employer-employee contributions. If they vest that account, then they are entitled to a second retirement allowance. Most return to work accounts end up being refunded because they're just going back subbing, and and they're not getting enough days in to get 5 years of service credit. But the exception is we have a new tier that began for individuals who became members of the retirement system on or after January 1st, 2022. We call it TRS-4. And individuals who retire with a TRS-4 account will not start a second account.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, if I could follow up. In your presentation, you talked about a breakdown on age and wage limits based on years of service.
Yes, sir.
What are those breakdowns, or do you know those offhand? How many?
So our retirees who retire with 27 or more years of service are eligible to earn up to 75% of their last annual salary measured on a daily rate. If they retire with less than 27 years of service, it's 65%.
What about days of service? Is that just reflective of that average daily rate to calculate the days?
Yes. So you take the days of service credit report for that member when they go in the classroom as a teacher, and you divide that. Well, you divide that over the full contract year, and then you assign days based on that.
And one more question, and then I'll finish for the day. On the temporary changes that were made that expire on June 30th, 2024, have those changes caused any significant actuarial impact on the TRS system?
Retirements this year were typical of retirements we had in past years, with the exception of the pandemic when retirements were really low. But we're seeing pretty much the same pattern this year that we've seen in previous years.
Okay, thank you.
Questions answered? Chairman Tipton, you good? Okay. I did have one other question I wanted to ask, and this is kind of a follow-up. Maybe you can give us some additional information. The issue with healthcare and Baptist Health, can you just give us a update on that, please?
Yes, sir. The TRS Medicare eligible health plan that we administer, it allows our members, our retirees, to go out of network without a change in cost. So as long as those Baptist healthcare providers are willing to accept Medicare, our retirees won't see any difference in cost.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Bo? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of administrative notes before we close down very quickly. The next meeting for the PPOB is scheduled for November 20th, 3 p.m. And then also, just so you can look ahead, the December 12th meeting, that's when the next one after that is scheduled. We may have some scheduling issues with possible inauguration events, that sort of thing. So just be aware that we might be doing that differently. One final note, each of the members of the General Assembly have received an email. It's a letter from Chairman Higdon and myself concerning bills that will be presented in the next regular session. If you would please pass on to the other members of the General Assembly in case they didn't see the email. If you have a bill that has any issues with pension systems, we're asking that those bills be presented to PPOB as a first step in the process, not so we can vote yes or no on the bill, but simply for us to provide some oversight, some evaluation in case there are some issues that maybe haven't come up during the process normally, that the PPOB can bring to the bill writers and the bill sponsors' attention. So please pass that word out for me. With that being the case, I would entertain a motion. And second it. We are adjourned. Thank you.